Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited to welcome you to this webinar. My name is Madeline Brown, and I'm a Senior Policy Associate here at the Urban Institute, where I work on wealth equity and early life wealth building programs like baby bonds. This year, I had the privilege of leading the team that spans 6 of our research centers to update our 9 charts on wealth inequality in the United States data feature, which we released in April 2024. We conducted this work as part of Urban's Financial Wellbeing Data Hub, an initiative launched last year to inform evidence-based solutions to advance equity and improve households' financial well-being. We believe in this work, this feature specifically, because of its demonstrated ability to ground a broad audience in the urgency of wealth inequality in this country. And we were grateful to be able to update it this year to better name the systems that cause these disparities and identify the policy directions we all can take to shrink these inequities. Racial wealth inequities have persisted for generations, reflecting the long-standing effects of racist policies, not individual intentions or deficits. Analyzing wealth inequality is important because wealth acts as insurance against tough times and translates into opportunity. It enables people to reach their full potential and contribute more to the overall economy, which benefits Americans of all backgrounds. People often think about wealth as access to large sums of money, but increasingly, policymakers are understanding that wealth is also resilience. Both income and wealth supports are required to support families' overall financial well-being. We're really excited today to host a broad conversation about what we can all do to address racial wealth disparities in this country. I want to thank the Capital One Foundation who funded this work. We hope this is a resource we can continue to keep up to date as new rounds of underlying data, including the Survey of Consumer Finances, are produced. And now just some quick housekeeping, if you'll bear with me before we get started. This event is being recorded and the recording will be posted online afterwards. We have provided ASL interpretation, as you should be seeing already, and enabled closed captioning. You can adjust caption settings with the Hide Show Captions button. Speaker biographies and related materials are available online and have also been dropped in the chat. All participants are muted, but you can type your questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time during this event. We do have Q&A sections throughout the agenda, and I will be monitoring our questions and sending them straight through to our speakers. If you are engaging with us online, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And at the end of this event, we'll send a link and would love for you to complete a survey so we can know how we're doing. And now we'll do just a quick overview of what we have ahead of us today. We are going to start with a presentation. I'll be handing it off to my colleague Ming Li, who will give an overview of our main findings from this feature. We'll then move to a fireside chat between Kilolo Kijikazi, Principal Senior Advisor to the Commissioner and former Acting Commissioner at the Social Security Administration, and my colleague Myra Jones-Taylor. After that, we'll have a panel moderated by my colleague Signa Mary McKernan, featuring Sheena Ashley, VP of Community Impact and Investment at the Capital One Foundation, Dr. Alex Conradell, Vice President of Policy and Research at the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative, and Janice Bowdler, Counselor to the Secretary for Racial Equity at the U.S. Department of Treasury. And with that, I'm really excited. I want to thank you all again for being here today. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce my colleague Ming Li Zhang, a Senior Research Associate here at Urban, who is our lead analyst for this feature to present our findings.
Thank you so much, Madeline. The 9 charts tell the story of wealth inequality in the United States. The first 3 charts we'll see in a moment show wealth disparities over time across race and age. The remaining charts present various drivers of wealth inequality, which we will review chart by chart. I will start by presenting those 3 key headlines on the trends in wealth inequality over time. Between 1963 and 2022, wealth increased for all groups. Families in the bottom group went from having debt to having wealth. Those in the middle nearly quadrupled their wealth. The wealthiest families saw their wealth increase more than 7-fold. The chart on the left shows that in 1963, the wealthiest families had 36 times the wealth of families in the middle of the wealth distribution. By 2022, as shown in the chart on the right, they had 71 times the wealth of families in the middle. This means that wealth is increasing, but so is inequality. Over the past 4 decades, the difference in wealth held by white, Black, and Hispanic families has grown. In 1983, the average wealth of white families was about $320,000 higher than the average wealth of Black and Hispanic families. By 2022, white families' average wealth was more than $1 million higher than that of Black and Hispanic families, meaning white families had 6 times the average wealth of Black and Hispanic families. Asian families' average wealth was $1.8 million, about 1.3 times that of white families. However, more disaggregated local analyses point to large differences in wealth among Asian Americans. The wealth gap widens with age. If we consider people born between 1943 and 1951, when they were roughly in their 30s in 1983, white families had 3 times as much wealth as Black families on average. By 2022, when they were in their 70s, the average white family had more than 4 times the wealth of the average Black family. This suggests that white families accumulate more wealth over their lives than Black or Hispanic families in the same age group, widening the wealth gap at older age. Given the trends over time, we now delve into some of the main drivers contributing to wealth inequality. A white man born between 1960 and 1964, now between the ages of 58 and 62, had earned an average of $2.9 million over his career, compared to $1.8 million for the average Black man. Women earn less than men overall, but gaps remain. The average white woman earned $1.6 million over her career, while the average Black woman earned $1.3 million. This is a result of labor market inequities, including employment discrimination and uneven pay across identical roles. Overall, we see earnings differ by race and gender. Home ownership is one of the main ways people build wealth, though 2022 estimates suggest home ownership rates among Black, Hispanic, and Asian families are increasing. Black Americans remain the only racial group with a home ownership rate below 50%. Racial disparities in home ownership persist today because of the stubborn legacy of racist housing policies, such as redlining and racial covenants. Disparities in retirement savings have increased 5-fold over the past 3 decades. In 1989, white families had about $50,000 more in average retirement savings than Black families, and about $35,000 more than Hispanic families. In 2022, white families had about $260,000 more in average retirement savings than both Black and Hispanic families. White families also had $20,000 more than Asian families in 2022, the first year that data points are available for Asian families in a survey of consumer finances. Structural barriers, including occupational crowding, have created inequities in earnings and access to and participation in workplace retirement savings plans. Black and Hispanic families are less likely than white and Asian families to have emergency savings. 57% of white households and 72% of Asian households had 1 month of income in emergency savings, compared with just 35% of Black and 38% of Hispanic households. These disparities are the result of exclusionary policies, such as redlining in the financial industry and means testing in public benefits programs that have historically penalized and discouraged people of color and low-income households from building savings. Federal tax policies fail to help families with low incomes build wealth. For example, the majority of the mortgage interest deduction, the top bar on your screen, goes to taxpayers at the top of income distribution. 76.5% of the mortgage interest deduction goes to the highest income group, and 17.2% goes to the second highest income group. The lowest income group receives less than half of 1% of these deductions. The same patterns hold true for state and local property tax deduction and retirement saving incentives. Black and Hispanic families who have lower average incomes receive much less of these subsidies than white families. In 2022, white families were about 5 times more likely than Hispanic families and nearly 4 times more likely than Black families to receive an inheritance. Though these disparities have fluctuated in size somewhat, they've largely persisted since 1989. Intergenerational wealth transfers vary by race because of racial disparities in wealth and earnings. Urban research showed that the shares of Black and white families who intend to leave a sizable estate are similar, but Black families are less likely to be homeowners or to have the necessary large amounts of wealth and income to do so. Wealth inequality in the United States is a complex and persistent challenge that requires bold policy solutions. The inequality is vast because of policy choices, and it can be reduced through policy choices too. The federal solutions above and the local solutions throughout the data feature itself show that policymakers at all levels have a role to play in eliminating racial and other wealth disparities. By addressing what's driving the economic inequality, these strategies could ensure all people have a fair shot at building wealth. Thank you so much. I will turn it over to Myra.
Thank you, Ming-Ri. And now I have the pleasure, first of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm Myra Jones-Taylor. I'm the Senior Vice President of Impact and External Affairs here at Urban. And I have the pleasure of being joined by Kilolo Kijikazi, who is the, make sure I get your title right, the Principal Senior Advisor to the Commissioner and former Acting Commissioner of the Social Security Administration. So welcome, Kilolo.
Thank you.
Sure. So we just heard Ming-Li share findings from Urban's recently updated 9 charts about wealth inequality in America. And I'm curious to hear from you what struck you about the feature, and then what, if anything, surprised you about the findings.
Thank you, Myra. And I'd like to say at the top, thank you to Signa Mary McKernan for inviting me to speak today. And I also want to thank the team at Urban who did such a great job on the new 9 charts. I need to provide a disclaimer up front that my remarks are my own and do not reflect positions of the administration writ large or the Social Security Administration in particular. That said, I want to acknowledge Melvin Oliver and Thomas Shapiro, whose groundbreaking book, Black Wealth, White Wealth, introduced the concept of the racial wealth gap and describe the discriminatory policies that have driven it. I also want to acknowledge the work of Derek Hamilton and William Darity, and a network of researchers of color across the country who designed and carried out a study to measure the racial wealth gap in 6 cities across the country. And this helped to bring the issue to national attention. And Derek has, along with his team, has recently released a report on the 7th city, Chicago. And I want to recognize the work of Urban Institute, which has explained the wealth gap and the racial wealth gap in ways that can be grasped by the general public using whiteboard videos and readily accessible reports, papers, blogs, and data visualization. The 9 charts are a tremendous use of interactive data visualization to convey information about the wealth gap and the racial wealth gap. I think the evolution of the charts is what is most impactful. The early versions primarily use a deficit model approach in the discussion of wealth disparities. And by that, I mean the write-ups attributed the reason for the disparities in wealth to limitations in the individual. As a result, the solutions offered focused on changing the individual. Over time, the discussion of the 9 charts has incorporated a systems approach that takes into account factors external to the individual that impinge on their economic and social well-being. Using this approach, the discussions focus on structural barriers, which are policies, programs, and institutional practices that facilitate wealth building by some groups while impeding wealth building by other groups. The latest iteration of 9 charts does a particularly good job of using a systems approach, both in examining the disparities and in proposing solutions for almost all of the charts. The only exception is the chart on inheritance, the 9th chart. This chart does examine some of the structural barriers that led to disparities in intergenerational wealth transfer, but it landed on a policy solution that uses a deficit model approach, estate planning assistance. Estate planning is necessary, but not sufficient. It may help address heirs' property, which is critical, but it does not address the policies and institutional practices that strip millions of acres of land away from African-American owners. As noted in a publication of the American Bar Association, this included state-sanctioned violence, intimidation, and lynching of Black farmers and their families, as well as discrimination by banks, financial institutions, and federal agencies. More recently, wealth stripping has come in the form of subprime loans to people who should have received prime loans and never should have faced foreclosure and the loss of homes they might have passed down to their children. Subprime loans were disproportionately directed to people of color. Policy solutions addressing wealth stripping actions should also be presented in the discussion of inherited wealth.
Thank you, Kilolo. So one thing we tried to do, and you spoke about this a little bit, one thing we tried to do in this update that's different from the last version in 2017 was provide policy directions for each topic-specific chart. So home ownership and retirement, for example, as well as more general large-scale federal policies at the end. And you've been a producer and consumer of research on racial wealth equity for a long time, and bring a perspective from philanthropy, federal government, and the research sector. So we're so happy that we have you here. And I'm really curious, in terms of action from the federal government, what large-scale proposals do you see as necessary to reduce wealth inequities in the United States? And I'm really curious to hear how your answer to this question may have changed over the last 5 years or 10 years.
So I'll answer the 2 questions in turn. It is critical to provide policy solutions that address systemic barriers, because without this, the researchers themselves, the consumers of research, and policymakers wrongly conclude that disparities are primarily due to limitations in individuals rather than structural barriers. And Madeline mentioned this earlier. One action that should be taken by the federal government is to hold employers accountable for discrimination in the labor market, including discrimination in hiring, pay, promotion, and retention. Discrimination also contributes to occupational segregation, and by this I mean the overrepresentation of women and people of color in lower paid jobs and underrepresentation in higher paid jobs. There are federal institutions that are working assiduously to address these forms of discrimination, but the resources that they have available to tackle these problems are not sufficient to monitor the vast number of employers in our society and hold accountable those who violate the law. As a result, workers facing discrimination in the labor market do not have equal access to one of the resources that they could use to help build their wealth, the level of earnings they deserve. For example, let's look at the job of caregiving, a job for which there is an increasing demand as baby boomers age. Here's the problem. We do not treat our caregivers like valuable professionals. Occupational segregation factors into this. According to the National Partnership for Women and Families, women make up 89% of paid caregivers. Women of color make up more than half of the direct care workforce. 28% are Black, 21% Latina, and 9% are other women of color. These levels are quite high, given that Black women make up only 7% of the labor market and Latinas make up 8%. Caregiving does not pay well or offer many, if any, fringe benefits. The Bureau of Labor Statistics indicates that home health and personal care workers at the 10th percentile of wages had an average annual salary of less than $25,000 in 2023. And at the median, it was about $33,500. The Center for American Progress found that 82% of direct care workers do not have access to a retirement savings plan or pension at work. As I said, employers should be held accountable for any labor market discrimination for which they may be responsible. In addition to this, the 9 charts provide a wide range of other policy solutions that could improve the economic security and wealth status of people who are performing critical but poorly compensated jobs. Now, in answer to the second part of your question, my analysis of problems has not changed over time. I have almost always examined problems and the way policies impact people by race, by ethnicity, and by gender. However, my presentation of my analyses of problems has changed over time. When speaking to audiences now, I try to make the issues relevant to them. Given the divisions in our society, there is reluctance by people to change their original positions, even when data have been presented that contradict their positions. So this is why I chose the example of caregivers. We are all getting older, and at some point, if we're lucky, we will live long enough to not be able to take care of ourselves all by ourselves. We'll need help, and many of us will need a caregiver. At a time when you want and need your caregiver to be entirely focused on you, maybe she's worried about how she will get home that evening because she doesn't earn enough to afford a car or pay for rideshare, and maybe she'll have to stand outside a long time waiting for a bus in the dark. So she's worried about her safety. At a time when you are vulnerable and need the consistency of having the same caregiver to see about you every day so that she can maintain your routines and have insight into where you have pain and what foods make you ill. At a time when you need this consistency, your caregivers may turn over constantly because they cannot afford to stay in your employ or the employ of the agency, perhaps sending them to you, or the employ of the long-term care facility in which you may reside. So the economic well-being of caregivers will touch the lives of each of their patients.
Thank you for that. Now honing in on your current role, typically in net worth calculations like those we produce in the feature, Social Security is usually not included as it's considered an annuitized form of wealth, right? Or a stream of income. But certainly there are individuals who contribute to Social Security via Social Security tax, as we know. And so some scholars, because of this, argue we should be including Social Security in net worth calculations, right? In general, what role do you see Social Security having in wealth building?
I don't know whether Social Security should be included in net worth calculations, but what I can say is prior research shows that Social Security reduces the racial wealth gap. Social Security's benefit formula helps mitigate some of the effects of labor market barriers. Benefits for lower wage workers represent a larger share of their pre-retirement earnings than benefits for higher wage workers. The benefit is progressive, but it cannot overcome the magnitude of the labor market barriers. White men have, and this was shown in chart 4, white men have been paid substantially more over their lifetimes than African American and Latino men and women on average. Since a worker's earnings history determines their eligibility and benefit level for Social Security, African Americans and Latinos receive a substantially lower dollar amount in benefits than white workers on average. And despite a lifetime of work, African American and Latino workers are more likely than white workers to face poverty in their senior years, even after receiving Social Security benefits.
So this is a selfish question from, speaking from Urban here, but we'd love to hear you reflect on what role we can play, or organizations like Urban can play in reducing wealth disparities.
So Urban Institute already plays a tremendously important role in producing evidence-based information that decision makers can equip themselves with to make sound decisions. As I mentioned earlier, Urban produces books, reports, papers, blogs, and data visualization like the 9 charts, which makes it incredibly easy for policymakers and the public to have the information they need to educate themselves. In addition, Urban provides training to young scholars and a platform for more experienced scholars to work on wealth disparities. And this is a great contribution, especially in diversifying the field.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I appreciate that. So I want to think about something that we hear a lot about in the news and is really on top of mind for a lot of people. And this is this idea that Social Security is projected to run out of money in 2035 based on the 2024 projection. And one solution is to raise payroll tax to continue funding Social Security. The other solution is to reduce Social Security benefits. Or some have proposed just a cold turkey approach to let Social Security become insolvent and get rid of the entire program altogether. And I would just love to hear your take. And when do you think we need to start taking seriously, or start addressing seriously this Social Security insolvency problem? Just love to hear your thoughts there.
So I am a member of the Social Security Board of Trustees, and we recommend that lawmakers address the projected trust fund shortfalls in a timely way, sooner rather than later, in order to phase in necessary changes gradually and give workers and beneficiaries time to adjust to the changes. However, we do not specify what policy actions should be taken because this is a matter for Congress to decide.
Thank you. So now I would love to open up the conversation to those participating on the call, or those in the audience. If people have questions, they can please enter them into the chat. But here we go. Here's one right now. So what is the greatest predictor of the remarkable disparity seen in wealth? Is it home ownership, retirement options during work years, lower incomes? And I can repeat that for you. So what is the greatest predictor of the remarkable disparity in wealth? You have thoughts there?
Yeah, so Urban and several other researchers have tried to parse this out. And homeownership is certainly one of those. Inherited wealth is another major predictor, I think. But also the whether someone is facing labor market barriers is another, because given the retirement plans that some employers offer, if you are able to have a job that offers such a plan and you can add contributions to it, it can make a huge difference. So for example, I may save $100 in an employer sponsored retirement savings plan. And that money gets matched by the employer. And then it gets invested in a mutual fund. And you may also save $100 every month. So we each assiduously save $100 a month, but my retirement wealth will be so much greater than yours because I had a structural advantage that you didn't have. So there are a number of ways in which individuals are impacted by these barriers in our society in different ways that have been created, as was said, by policies and programs and institutional barriers that impact us in different aspects of our life and result in these disparities in wealth.
So we're talking about wealth. That's the whole, disparities in wealth. And one of our audience members would love to hear you say more about why wealth matters. Relatedly, this person has heard some leaders in the field suggest that shared prosperity may be a more important or clear or meaningful North Star than wealth equality. So I'd love to get your take on that.
So first, why wealth matters. I think we saw that most clearly during the pandemic. Individuals who were able to have a stock of savings could go and go to the grocery store and store up on all the supplies that they needed to be able to seclude themselves and stay safe. Individuals who don't have that kind of wealth set aside have to go out as they have the income come in. So maybe they have to go out and shop every week if they only get paid once a week and they don't have enough saved up to be able to provide for themselves without having to go out that often. That puts you at physical risk. So there's one very clear, very recent example. To take that example a little further, those who had greater wealth and might have had a second home in an area that had low or a smaller population of people, they could go off to this second home. And if they had jobs that allowed them to telework, they could be away from large numbers of people and again, be further able to protect themselves from the virus before there was vaccination. Individuals who, let's say, just have an apartment and maybe it's a fairly large apartment building and that's where they have to be, there's much greater chance of them coming into contact with someone else who might have been infected with COVID. In terms of shared prosperity.
Oh, sorry, no, please.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have thoughts about that right now. I think that's something that I'd like to contemplate a bit more before offering an opinion.
No, I appreciate that. In discussion of policy solutions, we often see a relatively comprehensive list, all of which are important to tackle. We've seen that here in the presentation of the 9 charts. When the solution lists become so long, there's a concern that it can inadvertently feel or lead to inaction. It's just, there's so much, where do you begin? Um, there's this question of what to prioritize and where to start. So where does research suggest that we should initially focus our efforts, knowing that the solution will need to be broad? And and I can always go to another question too, if you want to think about that one.
No, that's fine. I think I don't buy that because there are a lot of potential solutions that has to become overwhelming because we have experts out here in many different areas. And so those different experts can tackle different areas. People who have expertise in the labor market can address labor market barriers. People who have expertise in land and land loss can address those areas. People who have expertise in housing can address those areas. And urban is well placed because the different policy centers allows it to have breadth in terms of the issues and policy solutions that it can tackle.
I really appreciate that response. Oh, Kilo, I keep cutting you off. I'm
Oh
sorry.
no, I just had another thought. You didn't cut me off.
Please.
Oh, I just lost it. Okay, that's okay. It'll circle back.
Well, I apologize for that. And I think there might be a little bit of a delay on my end. I really appreciate that question and that or your response to that question, because I think, as speaking from urban here, we have so many different research areas and policy practice areas that we focus on to tackle so many of these questions because we know there isn't just one way to get at many of the challenges that we face in this country, especially when it comes to wealth inequality. So I appreciate that we can all do our part from whichever expertise we bring to this question, that from within there we need to be prioritizing, but it's certainly not that we need to wait while housing or Treasury takes over. So I really appreciate your response there. And I'm going to leave that as your final question and response, unless you remembered what you were going to say. I'll hand it over to our dear colleague and friend.
I did remember. Not
Great.
everyone has to be an expert on every issue area, but what works well is when you partner with others so that you can share your expertise and just as was done with the 9 charts, and Madeline indicated that she worked with 6 centers, I think. Bringing that together is what really helps us find solutions and make them available for policymakers and others who can implement them.
Well, I will let that be your last response because I'm very fond of it coming from urban, where we tackle issues from many different parts of the organization. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. And I am now going to hand it over to our dear colleague, Signa Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Signa Mary McKernan, a vice president at Urban Institute and one of the 9 charts about wealth inequality original authors. And I'd like to thank Kilolo for her foundational research on structural racism, which provided us with that evidence to include as systems context in our updated charts. And it's a pleasure to introduce our 3 panelists now for our discussion. They are 3 extraordinary leaders in government, business, and nonprofit. And I'd like to invite each of them to turn on their cameras as I introduce them. I'll start with Sheena Ashley, Vice President of Community Impact and Investment at Capital One. Sheena is President of Capital One's Insight Center and President of the Capital One Foundation. Sheena is also a former Urban Institute Vice President who launched and led our Office of Race and Equity Research. So Sheena, great to have you on the Urban Institute stage again. And thank you for supporting 9 Charts About Wealth Inequality. Janice Bowdler is Counselor for Racial Equity for the U.S. Department of Treasury. And she is playing a tremendous role in government now, and she brings decades of experience on wealth inequities with her. The two of us were together on an NBC4 Viewpoint show talking about wealth inequities back in 2013. So great to have you with us at Urban Institute today. And then Alex Comardell, Vice President of Policy and Research at the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative, where Alex is responsible for developing and overseeing the organization's mission-aligned advocacy and research agendas and its related strategic initiatives and activities. So thank you all for joining us. And to get us started, I'd love to hear from each of you. As government, business, or nonprofit leaders, why is addressing wealth inequities important? That's a question we've already had from the audience, so I'm glad to get your viewpoints on it too. Yeah, what do you think? And I'll let you decide who goes first, or I can call. Okay,
I'm
Sheena?
happy to jump in. It is so
Thank you.
great to be here. And also really tough to follow Kololo, who has really been such a leader in this field, and so grateful for the comments she shared. I think there was a lot that Kololo shared that really sets the context for why financial institutions in particular in business have to very much be concerned about wealth building, and part of being a center of that. I think in the beginning, as she mentioned, some of the structural issues and barriers and legacies of some of the past work really have to take responsibility and try to lead against the current that is created in communities and for individuals who are trying to continue to make thriving lives for themselves. And so it is very important for financial institutions to be there. But even beyond that responsibility, financial institutions have the privilege of being at the center of people's financial lives. And as such, we have a role to play in supporting both their short-term and long-term financial resilience, which is what we really capture here when we are talking about wealth equity. Janice, I see you're ready.
Yeah, I'll chime in. Well, first of all, I want to continue the congratulations and the thanks. And I really feel the need to start out by shouting out Kololo, who gave shout outs to many of the scholars in this space, but many of us know that those scholars would not have had the resources to do the work they did if it wasn't for Kololo at the Ford Foundation and Kololo, your foundational work to build out the Experts of Color network that has seeded a field of diverse scholars and advocates and practitioners. And I got to benefit from that as a younger policy analyst at Unidos. And I think I benefited a lot more than I contributed, frankly, because it was just so amazing to be part of that network that is still my social and professional network now. So I want to thank you for the work that you've done to shepherd this, not just as an advocacy objective, but from every point of making sure that we've got the people with the lived experience around the table to talk about the issue, that we have the data available, that we're thinking with ambition and scale around systems. We owe a lot to your foundational work. So thank you, Kololo, for everything that you've done. And Sheena, I feel like we're making virtual webinars a habit. So I hope that we get to do it in person soon. But with my pleasantries over, let me say that from, to bring this work, and I standing on the shoulders of all the work and the people that we've talked about, to bring that into Treasury, I think this has been a fundamental question, not just for the administration, but for Treasury in particular. And Secretary Yellen has really led us in a conversation around the need to talk about the consequences of racial inequity in our national economy. And we know that we could choose a route where we build an extractive economy. We have that history, we have that capability, but we're trying to chart out a different path that says that we can build the economy that we all aspire to, and that we're actually going to be more sustainable, more successful, and grow the pie for everybody when we're unlocking the unrealized potential of people that have been systemically marginalized and pushed to the edges of our economy. So given our, just to be brass tacks and frankly parochial about it in a way that I think I need to in a treasury seat for the good of our economy, the way that our demographics are going in an environment of global competitiveness, we can't afford our racial inequity. We can't afford wealth disparities. We have to be thinking about how we rectify our historical wrongs and how we build a different set of systems. And so I know we're going to get into some of the particulars, so I will hold the other soapboxes I have planned on some of those solution sets and some of the things we're working on. But I think it's really important that from as one of the agencies that leads the conversation for the administration around the national economy and the global context, that we talk about this as fundamentally important to us in terms of our national economic interests.
Yeah, and I'll jump in, and it's hard to follow. I am honestly in total agreement with my co-panelists. This, for me and for the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative and people that look like me that are in this wealth inequity space or racial wealth justice space, it feels like we're in the fight for our lives at the moment. And to the point that Janice made, it's important on the economic front. I think we recognize that we're leaving about $1.5 trillion on the table as a nation by not taking action to address racial wealth inequities. But I really appreciated the earlier comment around whether we should be focused on building wealth for all, or is this a matter of actual shared prosperity? And I think for us, building wealth also begets shared prosperity if we do it the right way, right? If we're doing it in a collective manner, not just in the interest of building up a small segment of, billionaires. In fact, we should be focused more on building an economy that helps be more redistributive, supports others across a range of their needs, not just in housing and entrepreneurship, but public health, their labor market participation, aging, and so many others. And so I really appreciated Kalola's comments around like the labor market, because the way that we approach wealth inequities and kind of is among this structural determinants of Black wealth framework, where we look beyond conventional debates about wealth and closing the racial wealth divide, not just homeownership or not just entrepreneurship, but also health, also access to, the ballot box, free and fair democracy and its relationship to wealth, climate resilience as well. And so I'm really excited to be with you all today and get deeper into the discussion.
Alex, I think
Terrific.
that's, oh, sorry,
Go ahead,
Stephen Mary. I
Sheena.
just wanted to say, Alex, I think that's a really important add that you made there in terms of clarifying that wealth building isn't just about individual level achievement, but it has spillover and like really relational aspects as it relates to community wealth building.
That's right.
And I think that's another reason that we have to give in terms of understanding why banks and other financial institutions are involved and care about wealth building, because even as people who have to focus on community and reinvestment, it doesn't take away from community investment to build individuals and family wealth. It actually is a major contributor to that community wealth building as well. And I'm glad you added that so that we don't have an either or perspective here.
That's right.
Yeah, thank you for that addition. It's not just individual, it's community, and it also results in shared prosperity. And just continuing, Alex, with you as you have your mic off, there was a question from the audience that I'd like to go back to, and that is just one of the things that we that our 9 charts about wealth inequality feature attempts to do is to tell the story of the components of wealth. We look at home ownership, we look at retirement savings, earnings, tax code benefits, emergency savings, and intergenerational transfers. And we look at these components for 2 reasons. One is to provide that context that Kilolo mentioned is so important about why these inequalities exist. So for homeownership, we heard right about exclusionary policies such as redlining, racial covenants, and appraisal bias. And then also to bring attention to the solutions for each of these different components. And in homeownership, it could be increasing the supply of affordable homes, expanding mortgage credit access, and helping people remain in their homes because it's not enough just to get a home. But as people are saying, like, well, what's the most important? Like, where do we focus? We heard Kilolo saying, focus where your expertise is. But can you tell us what you see as the major drivers of wealth building and how important you think they are respectively?
Yeah, this is really tough because I just described like a variety of different levers for addressing racial wealth disparities, and we kind of sit at the intersection of multiple. I'll just, name that, we fully agree with the role of inheritances and the other indicators in the 9 charts. Some of the more recent research talks about the role of capital gains and its relationship in terms of driving the racial wealth divide and the impending great wealth transfer. We know that the top 10% of households that are obviously predominantly white in this nation own about 90% of all stocks, which means the gains from financial benefits lock out families who don't have access to investment opportunities that can contribute to what unfortunately is like an $84 trillion wealth transfer over the next 2 decades. From baby boomers to younger generations. And so that's a chief concern for us because it adds a sense of urgency around pulling very bold levers beyond just a bunch of down payment assistance programs and things like that, right? So that's all at the macro level. I mean, we talk about homeownership and entrepreneurship all at the macro level as well. I would like to just kind of bring us down more locally. A lot of the work that we do is in partnership with local governments and with community-based organizations that are trying to tackle this from another angle than compared to more conventional approaches. And what we find is that there's the role of economic development that often gets overlooked in displacing people, which also contributes to wealth disparities. And so I would just like add that little layer to it. There are a lot of decisions that are being made on the ground in our municipal government and our county government, et cetera, beyond what state and federal governments are doing, that are also contributing to the displacement of people in their communities. And it's affecting their pocketbooks and their household balance sheets because they're having to come out of pocket, sometimes unexpectedly to find a new place to live. And it's because of literal incentives, right? We're incentivizing development that is designed to displace human beings while inviting, other institutions or entities into communities that are not going to contribute to the preservation of historically Black communities, and especially in our case. And so I'll just add that nuance to it. But, there are a lot of things that we can do to address some of the bigger drivers that I know we'll talk to, the least of which being the tax code. We talk a lot about household tax protections and how we can make the tax code more responsive to households. But I would also like to add the layer of economic development and how the tax code facilitates displacement through economic development at the local level and even at the state level too.
Thank you. Such an important addition. Anybody else want to jump in? And, as I heard earlier too, we often think about wealth as these big major components, but emergency savings and resilience is key. We heard some of those examples from Kilolo about the pandemic. Think about it a lot with people's ability to cover an unexpected medical bill. We know how common medical debt collections is, or a car tire blowout so that you can get to that caregiving job. Um, Anybody want to add any other components that they think are important?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you guys added that to the 9 slides, Signa Mary, because it's I think sometimes the wealth building conversation can feel a lot like Cinderella. Like you too can save for retirement or buy a house after you pay your rent, after you like manage these emergency expenses. And like it's back to some of Kalolo's comments about our old deficit model. Like you're a bad budgeter because you had to dip into your savings that was supposed to be for home ownership, but you used it to get a new set of tires so you could actually get to your job, so you could keep padding your savings, right? Like we cannibalize one for the other. We also know that absent having that short-term cushion, people dip into retirement savings. They dip into their 401k if they're lucky enough to have it, or they draw on their home equity because life happens. And wealth acts as that cushion and shock, which we cushion for expense shocks that we want people to have. And I think the American Rescue Plan provided us such a first of all, like critical set of supports for families. But now we have real case studies. We know that the child tax credit reduces child poverty by upwards of 50%. Like we cut it in half. We now know how to do that. And President Biden has put it back in the budget every year. We know that when we helped families pay their rent, when they were at risk of eviction, like many of us on this call, we all went through the foreclosure crisis together. We know what that looked like for families. We didn't do that this time around. And I will let the other economists on in my building and likely on this call debate the impact of some of those, but I don't think we talk enough about the preventative medicine of not going through a wave of evictions and a wave of foreclosures. Through the state and local fiscal recovery funds, a number of cities essentially ran guaranteed income pilot projects with those funds. And so what we saw is that when we give families the resources they need to meet their basic needs, in fact, their savings levels went up. That cushion in order to meet long-term or to meet the unexpected shocks went up. And I also am not going to try to claim correlation here, but I do want to point out that over the same period, we also saw wealth levels rise. And so when we help families actually meet their basic needs and give them the cushion to be able to withstand what are the predictably unpredictable aspects of life, that they are going to do better. And then we as a country do better when we help the most vulnerable among us survive, again, what are just routine aspects of life, not down to anybody's like bad budgeting practices.
That's right. And even in the predictable parts of the wallet have just become, with higher costs, so much harder for people to keep a grasp on those things that they have. Not even trying to save for a shock, just saving for the day-to-day and the increased costs on those things. It's important that we're building that into the conversation on wealth building so that we also take responsibility within this field around trying to reduce costs as part of a way in which we allow individuals to be on the pathway for saving for emergencies and then ultimately building wealth for the long term. That's one of the things that we have started to think about in our philanthropic strategy, both how we help return dollars to wallet when people have access to things like public benefits or credits that there's too much friction to receive for that to come back to them. How do we make that easier? But also then how do we think about investments in things like affordable housing as part of a wealth building strategy? Because people have to be able to reduce the cost of some of those known expenditures in order to be able to have the ability to save. So I think by broadening that, Signa Mary, into both the short term and long term, you've enabled more people to come around and build broader strategies that don't have us to think that wealth building is for something, as Janice said, to achieve once you've reached a certain level. But it is something that we could be striving for everyone in the day-to-day for how we live our financial lives.
Yeah. And even while you're trying to save, we're also living in an environment that's just full of predators that are offering and pushing debt-based products that are extremely high interest, very harmful. I can't tell you enough how saturated, low-income communities and historically Black communities are by these vultures, for lack of a better term. that are, dangling kind of products that are completely wealth stripping in front of folks when they experience financial shocks and financial disasters. I used to work at a consumer protection agency in the state of Alabama many years ago. It was one of my first jobs, and I sat on the front desk and answered the phone all day from people complaining about being, concerned about fraud and scam from folks trying to give them free credit cards or send them checks in the mail. So, fraud and scam is also a big issue that's affecting folks across generations. But we really need to be honest about the regulatory controls and whether or not they're strong enough to prevent these predatory actors from taking over and completely draining families and whole communities of resources. Because they're going to be the first go-to. And it's because there are unfortunately some incentives for them to operate and be in business in these communities, depending on the state that you live in, right? And so I just want to put that out there. Saving is hard, especially when you have so much debt, dangling in front of you. Me and my friends, we always joke about the fact that we have negative net worth because we all went to school, we went to college, and we probably will until the rest of our lives, even though we're homeowners. It's just the way it is right now. And so that also makes it very difficult to save in times of despair, economic despair. So, this environment that we're in is, all the things we're talking about exist in a context a policy context that is not always as responsive to the real economic conditions that people are suffering through, especially those that don't have that safety net. And, since we're on the topic of safety net, and we're talking about people's like the full suite of needs that people have, like the actual safety net itself, cash assistance, food assistance, depending on where you live, prohibits asset building. And so it's like literally illegal or it makes you ineligible for the benefit. And we have to really reckon with that as well. So.
Okay, I'm hearing consumer protection. I'm hearing, resilience, small, big. Janice, I love the Cinderella as how it used to feel to people. So I like that. And Sheena, the short and long term, and thinking of costs too. So we're starting to turn to solutions, and that's key because that's really what today is all about is we definitely don't want to just lift up problems with 9 charts about wealth inequality. We've been talking about this for a long time. Initially it was, problems a decade or two ago, and hopefully we're well beyond that now. So just shifting gears to those solutions, Janice, I'd like to start with you. Treasury facilitates wealth building for Americans in a number of ways, via the tax code, community development, homeownership, small business investments. Can you share a bit about your office's approaches to equity in these different areas?
Yeah, and I'm going to be very tactical. And if you've seen me at all in the last year and a half, 2 years, I'm a broken record, and I will continue to be on a couple of things. First, let me say, I want to underscore a point that I made earlier in terms of solution sets we know work, particularly around child tax credit. We know the areas of the tax code that are problematic, ways that the tax code could be leveraged to drive more wealth and more support to vulnerable families. From a very tactical perspective, like many of those take acts of Congress, and they're not in the purview of Janice with a magic wand at the Treasury Department. So I want to acknowledge that I think those things are important, and there are a number of really great ideas out there. But right now, we are living an extraordinary moment where we have 3 once-in-a-generation bills in front of us: the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. And that is essentially we are in the middle of building the next middle class, like this level of public investment. And that is what drives wealth, and it is what people of color have repeatedly and historically been left out of. So my current obsession in my seat at the Treasury Department is how to make sure that we are thinking about industrial and supply chain policies and climate policies as economic development and wealth policies. And my biggest lever at the Treasury Department, in addition to making sure that solar incentives and all of those things make it to families. Those are important and create a lot of opportunity. If anybody wants to nerd out on those things, happy to take questions on them. But Treasury is also uniquely situated with some of our sister economic agencies to think about business ownership. And we haven't talked as much about that. And I step into that knowing that it's a little bit controversial. I think from the, if I think about the wealth field over the years, it's like, is business ownership really a driver of wealth? Because wealth begets wealth, and having lower wealth to start with and less money to start up your business increases your risk of failure. We know that's the case. So we have, with the tools we've been given by Congress through the State Small Business Credit Initiative, through the delivery of capital, through proximate institutions like Black and Brown owned banks, Asian and Native owned banks, CDFIs, how can we get capital out to business owners who are poised to seize opportunities in the infrastructure, chips, and climate supply chains? And I think it's really important that at this time where we are throwing off so much money, large businesses are getting so much money to onshore their supply chains, that business owners out of our community get the chance to compete for those contracts. So we've been doing that by getting capital out, by challenging the private sector to think about their commitment to their supply chain, making pledges to match the federal government's commitment of 15% of small and disadvantaged businesses to bolster CDFIs and MDIs that are serving those small businesses. One quick thing that I want to mention that is small and I think sometimes goes unnoticed is that as part of the State Small Business Credit Initiative, and quick recap for those that aren't familiar, $10 billion over 10 years out to states, has its challenges going out through states, but working with the program that we have, back of the envelope math, around 30% of that money will go out in the form of equity investments, not debt. And so if you, with the goal of levering that up 10 times over the next 10 years, that is a significant amount of growth capital equity investment going out into communities. And we know the numbers on that kind of money are dismal. I'm not going to sit here and tell you the debt markets are perfect, but we don't get those big equity checks in our communities. So one of the strategies that we have worked with states on is to work with diverse-owned investment funds to help increase our likelihood of getting to diverse entrepreneurs and making sure they're getting those equity checks. So of course, I'm on this webinar without the exact right number in front of me in this moment. So somebody's going to Google me and I'm going to be one or two off. But of the nearly 50 VCs that have received investment so far, over 30 of them are either diverse-led or have a dedicated diverse investment strategy, which when we compare that to VC numbers overall, where we're like scraping to get to 1% of the money, it's pretty significant. So when I venture into this space of thinking about supply chain and business ownership as a wealth building strategy, I'm also thinking about capital from the smallest business up to the growth checks that businesses need to really scale and be successful. That was my big soapbox that I needed to do, Signa Mary, so I'll keep my answer shorter after that one.
No, thank you. It was great to hear about equity too, not just debt. Terrific. So that's on the government side and on the Treasury side, and good to hear about what that Cinderella magic wand is able to do and not able to do. So thank you for that distinction. Sheena, I want to turn to you next and see what role do you see the financial sector needing to take in working toward racial wealth equity?
This is a great one, and I won't answer from just my point of view on this, which I definitely have, but I've also had the great privilege of going across this country with many of our teams over the past couple months on listening tours to hear from the communities we serve and different sector leaders around where they see the responsibility for the financial sector being in terms of doing racial wealth equity. And so I love to share from their perspective because we've been listening, and that's been informing our approach. You can see how it's informed our approach in our recently released $265 billion community benefits plan that we released as part of our proposed acquisition of Discover. But that's given us a moment to really step back and hear in this time of high inflation and where the communities see themselves, where do they want us to think about over the next 5 years, really prioritizing our work, but also broader in the financial services sector, where we could really have a role to play in wealth building. And the key things that we heard fall under these areas. One is sharing the expertise through some of our own resources, like we have at the Capital One Insight Center, where we share data and information, but doing that through partner organizations like Urban, like other groups who can provide that expertise and really bring it front and center to people working on these issues day in and day out. There's great demand for more of that, to be actively involved in how this is being shaped, not just a provider of resources in terms of funding, but being a provider of expertise, even thinking about the future of how AI is going to shape a lot of the conditions in communities and workforce development. How do we bring our expertise as a leading institution with AI to help community organizations on the ground be prepared for that and position their communities for that big change? That's one real thing that we heard. I think also, as Alice was talking about with predatory actors, a lot of demand for financial institutions to use their voice in power and identifying where those predatory actors are, being able to distinguish where we are offering products that are actually wealth building and where there are products out there that are wealth stripping, and really being bold to come out and talk about those things through some of our advocacy partners. Definitely high demand for that. And I would say the biggest thing has been access to credit. I mean, like, there's no other role that people really want to see financial institutions really doubling down with, providing more access to credit, and particularly for subprime people with subprime credit scores. This is something that we heard about a lot for people who may be just starting out on their credit journey, or, as we talked about before, trying to recover from unexpected expenses, or have had prior experiences with predatory lending. Finding a healthy way for them to begin a credit journey that is fits, doesn't give them over credit for a position that they're going to be in, but really help them have it as a stepping stone toward building wealth and things like home ownership. I really am proud of the legacy of Capital One in being a financial institution that has enabled 42 million customers who have had subprime or no FICO scores when they open an account with us to achieve prime or even better FICO scores. I do think there's a role for financial institutions to really be able to make the case for how they responsibly move people along the credit journey. Because in this society and everything that we do now, you can't actually access anything without some sort of credit. So making sure that we're able to help the consumer and not put it all on the consumer to be able to distinguish and define that. Those accesses for us to really play our role to make sure that we're bringing them at that place in order to move them along. Because we are, for most consumers, their first experience with credit, I feel like we have an awesome responsibility to be that type of institution that helps them access credit safely and wisely as part of their wealth building.
Yeah, thank you. So important. Like you said, credit reports are used for many things, I think. And, recently we wrote about how about half of employers use it for screening and employment. So lots to do there, and good to see that moving up from subprime to prime. And next I want to turn to Alex to hear about local solutions. What local solutions do you think have the most potential to address the racial wealth gap? And, what state and federal policies would support work that you're doing locally?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take a bit of a different direction. My favorite policy solutions are those that go beyond kind of the conventional topic of housing and entrepreneurship, and even education. Obviously, as we know, we can't educate our way out of the racial wealth gap, but instead are focused more on like restorative justice and environmental justice. And this is the interdisciplinary approach that we lead with at the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative, because we recognize that there is certainly some intersection of this work, and we call all of our work, we consider it all to fit within a portfolio of solutions to tackle the racial wealth divide, because you can't just focus on just one, housing or business development. And so that's me preaching a little bit. I apologize, but just want to make that super clear. But so some examples that we like to promote and cite. I'll name, in the environmental justice space, really appreciate what local governments are doing around solar and cleaning up toxic sites and addressing like heat incidences of heat, severe heat, which contributes to both poor health outcomes and economic outcomes in communities. Renewable energy projects are actually wealth building projects in our opinion, and that's been proven as well. They can help boost property values and obviously lower healthcare costs. So the intersection of those things are really important. And local governments are doing really wonderful work around that, leveraging local dollars as well as federal dollars, and more to come with some pretty significant federal investments in climate justice in the coming years. And then we have, what we refer to as more reparative policies, like child trust accounts or baby bonds, which I know Urban is also doing a lot of work on. Connecticut's and Washington, D.C.'s programs get a lot of love. Bragging a little bit, but we've got a little momentum down here in the Deep South, which is really exciting. But these tools offer long-term wealth building by creating savings accounts for children at birth. And they grow over time. It can be used for wealth building activities like homeownership or education when they reach adulthood. And our perspective is that the use of funds should be unrestricted, just to give autonomy and agency to people, which is really important. There's also programs like what we've seen in Evanston, which created what they refer to as one of the first local reparations programs in Illinois, through housing assistance grants to address historical harms in the housing market and through redlining. But on the note of reparations, there is the movement of local reparations efforts, and we're really excited about that. We do understand reparations to be one of the most direct ways to tackle the racial wealth divide. But they're going to be local. It's insufficient at the local level, and we also recognize that too. Local governments can't do it alone. Like they have to, like I said earlier, put it into that package of or portfolio of solutions. We know, thanks to the work of folks like Dr. Darity, that the total bill owed to Black Americans is about $14 trillion. And they actually did the work to estimate the total municipal and state budgets in the US. It's about $5 trillion. So you can do the math. It's just insufficient to rely on a bunch of local reparations movements. But the momentum at the local level and at the state level is really exciting, and can't wait to see how that bubbles up into a big federal package for repair. And so I will end on this less optimistic note that I mentioned earlier, like in the fight for our lives around this, because a lot of the reparative approaches I just named are also under assault currently, through the courts. We have been facing many legal challenges because these are efforts that are targeting low-income communities and communities of color. And there are anti-equity activists that are vehemently opposed to doing anything that could help repair the harms of their ancestors. And so we are, concerned about that. And like I mentioned, want to make sure we are taking advantage of all the regulatory powers that we have, and really bolstering in our call to action, since I am the nonprofit on the call, calling for deeper investments in movement building organizations like mine and like all of my partners and peers that are standing up, speaking out, and advocating for stronger and robust investments in movement infrastructure so that we can combat what's happening in our communities for those that are doing the work of addressing racial wealth inequities. And so That investment has already gone a long way. There's so much more that can be poured into it because we have quite the battle ahead of us. So.
Okay, thank you all for those different vantage points on solutions that are available. And now I'd like to turn to answer some of the audience questions, and we have many of them coming our way, which is terrific. So just the first one, to Alex's point, there were two questions from the audience about this work in the context of the Supreme Court decision on race-conscious admissions. How do people think of this decision in the context of racial wealth equity? And how do you craft interventions or policies targeted at racial wealth equities when you cannot consider race?
I'm happy to say a couple things here that I think are really important. And I will say as a non-lawyer specifically, who's not litigating and in no way qualified to give legal advice. But my understanding of what is coming out of the cases is having to be very clear about documenting harms and not making the presumption of harm associated with race. And so there's that we can unpack that. I think we probably all, there's probably a number of us that would argue otherwise or have lived experiences that suggest otherwise. But I think what it has underscored for us here at the Treasury Department, and a reason why I think the work of the Urban Institute and work like what Alex leads is so important, is because the data are our friend here. We have to continue to document. We'd like to be maybe in a world where like some of this is just very obvious and clear cut, but we have to have the documentation to draw the line between the problem and the solution set, and we can't shortcut that process. And so, at least from our work from the Treasury Department perspective, is making sure that the solutions that we put forward are very much grounded in the problem set as well as the evidence of the solution to the greatest extent possible.
That's exactly right, Janice. And the only thing I will add in addition to that for financial institutions like ours, those that are regulated, a lot of this work falls under the Community Reinvestment Act. And so for us, this is still business as usual in the way that we do our investments. And unfortunately, the amount of geographic segregation in this country, when you are looking at geography and where low and moderate income communities are placed, that has such an overlap on race and ethnicity as well, that to direct those resources in congruence with the Community Reinvestment Act still allows us to address things like the racial wealth gap.
And I'll be blunt, being in the nonprofit space. So I'll say, one, you can't address this massive racial wealth divide without being direct and specific about who you're actually looking to help. And so that's point number one. I think we've already seen kind of the chilling effects. And so I appreciate, Janice, you did great interpreting kind of the law as it currently stands. But that's not how it's broadly interpreted. There's a lot more risk averse activity in the sector that's making it very hard for organizations like mine and our peers to move the work forward. And so we have to be very honest about that. Folks that don't have lawyers need lawyers so they can accurately interpret the law and our ability to advance our objectives. My objective, my mandate here is to build the wealth of the 2 million Black people in the Deep South that have zero net worth. Like that's what I do for a living right now, at least until I became a famous DJ or something in the coming years. And so, that there's a level of courage that those of us in the activist and coalition and ecosystem building space have to exercise. But I will give a very specific example. partners and I introduced baby bonds legislation in the state of Georgia. And we didn't walk into the Capitol and say, I want to cut the racial wealth gap in half. You're just not going to do that in Georgia and get something introduced, right? And so there is strategy that is includes inside and outside game strategy to help move some of this work forward. And you have to interpret what organizations like mine can do within our 501(c)(3) restricted guidelines, right? There's only so much we can do. But there is a way to move this work forward. It's not as straightforward as, you know, the sexy thing to do 10 years ago was let's disaggregate the data by race. And now all of a sudden we're moving, we're chugging along. That's just not it anymore. We've got to be far more tactical and just as smart and just as resourced as the folks on the other side are whenever they're attempting to take us down. So there are ways to do it. It's just a lot more strategic. And the other, elephant in the room is that sometimes I can't get on a webinar with 600 people and talk about how we do it, right? So that's the other side of it too.
It's great to have you. And in our last minute here together, just one last question, and that is, each of you has been in this field for some time and have approached wealth inequality from a variety of different roles. So I'm curious if anything about the conversations today stand out that might feel different from 5 or 10 years ago. And especially, I'd love to hear if there are any developments that make you particularly optimistic about the future.
So I will double down on my earlier comments, which again, not in any way to take away from the long-term work we need to do and more structural solutions that I think are that we need to press for. But we are in a moment where we have trillions of dollars going to create a new economy, and that has enormous economic repercussions and opportunities. I will say, I think the conversation is dominated by who gets those jobs. That matters, but who gets the wealth that is going to spin off from all of these investments? Which communities are going to get the new chips manufacturing plant? Where is that supply chain going to locate, and who is part of that supply chain? I think that is going to fundamentally reshape. If we look at those charts 10, 15, and 20 years from now, they are going to be heavily influenced on where these investments physically landed and who was able to participate in the economic growth that spun off of those investments. So I wouldn't want us at all to take our eye off of our big picture goals and really innovative solutions or historical redress solutions. But I'm also a bird in hand kind of person, and this is money going out the door. And at least as long as I'm in my seat, I'm doing my darndest to make sure that those investments reflect the diversity and opportunity that I know exists within our communities.
Okay, thank you. Sheena, one sentence, and Alex,
Yes,
one sentence.
very quickly. I am very excited about this new middle class that Janice talked about. And I think the work is to just wrap all of our collective arms around them to make sure that the wealth they accumulate and build isn't stripped away or impacted drastically by climate-related extreme weather that Alex talked about, but that we give people the resources they need to sustain that grip that they have now on the middle class.
And then I will just double down. This is it's not sound cliche, like once in a generation level of investment in the ability to leverage federal funds to change the game. And so I'm really eager to lock arms with advocates and others that have a seat at the table and drive those investments to the communities that have far too often been left out. And so that's the opportunity that we have now that we probably haven't seen in over 10 years since the Great Recession. And so I'm just really eager to make it happen.
All right. Well, thank you for landing us on that optimistic note. I think that's key. So I want to thank our panelists and the audience for terrific questions. It's great to be focused on solutions and not just policies. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Madeline to conclude our event today. Thank you.
Thank you, Signa Mary. I just want to echo thanks to our audience for being here today, for your engagement. We had more than 35 questions, I think, came in. We tried to get through as many as we could, but hope that everybody stays engaged. We're incredibly grateful to be able to do this work and to help bring the field together to address racial wealth inequities. And we know when we heard it today, it's going to take the engagement of folks from all sectors, and hope that the broad range of solutions that we talked about today from all levels has given everyone some inspiration and direction as you leave this webinar. I want to thank our panelists and speakers, Kilo, Alex, Janice, and Sheena, as well as my colleagues, Myra, Ming Lee, and Signa Mary, and a couple others at Urban working behind the scenes, Ivy Hunter, Thea Guerin, and Apoyla Wakulam for all their work. As a reminder, this event was recorded. It will be available online after this session. We would be grateful if you could please take 1 to 2 minutes to complete the survey that just got dropped in. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for being here.